let's start that debate right now. It's going to be continuing for a while, but the question is, who would pay for these policies and what would they mean for the economy? Let's welcome Basil Smikle. He is former New York State Democratic Party Executive Director. He's now a lecturer in policy and politics with the City University of New York. Also, Genevieve Wood is senior advisor and spokesperson with the Heritage Foundation. And let's throw this up. I am a little surprised by Steve's poll showing that there's such overwhelming majority for some things, maybe like Medicare for all and free college. Not so surprised by things like people wanting paid maternity leave or boosting the minimum wage, because you saw McDonald's today saying they're not going to fight that anymore. Right. What do you think is really happening here, Basil?
You know, I'm actually not surprised by these results. And you're absolutely right, Steve, that parties are designed to try to frame these arguments in a certain way for voters to take sort of the burden off of them to try to figure this stuff out on their own. But I look back to 2016. If you actually look at the numbers, particularly here in New York, in places where Bernie Sanders won in the primary, Donald Trump also won in the generals across the country. What that says to me is that there was a thread of their arguments for a very short period of time. System is rigged. The elites in both parties aren't really supporting you and working for you. And I think a lot of folks bought into that. Obviously, Donald Trump is president, and Bernie Sanders is doing well in the polls here on the Democratic side. So whether you're a Democrat or Republican, there are elements of their argument that a lot of Americans actually bought into.
That it resonates with.
Absolutely. But there's still a healthy distrust of government, which is why I think...
So how do you get to the government running some of these big programs?
So you don't want government actually running a lot of these things. There is a healthy sort of distrust, as I said, for whether or not government can actually deliver for you, but they want to see change.
Genevieve, let's try and tackle that question, though. A lot of people want these things, but the question remains, how do you pay for them?
Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, look, when people say something's free, everybody goes, great, I'm in for that. But as we all know, if you think something's expensive now, wait till it's free and when the government's handing it out. And I think, look, I think when people start seeing the details of these plans, that's when you begin to see the popularity start to go down. I mean, for example, look at things like the Green New Deal that Democrats were so high on just, a couple of weeks ago. And just yesterday, you couldn't find one member of the U.S. Senate to actually stand up and say, I'm for it, even though we've been told we've only got 12 years left on the earth if we don't do something about it. The environmental policies are so popular, but yet you couldn't get anybody, once the details started trickling out, to actually come out and say, I'm for this. And that's because a lot of numbers and other things started coming out that Americans weren't going to agree with.
Genevieve, I mean, Americans want, I mean, I understand they want free things, but that's offset by wanting freedom. And when they go to the polls, when it's all said and done, I've often asked, how does a Republican ever get elected again? Because he's not promising, or he or she is not promising all these free things. How does it happen? How do aspirational candidates get elected that are talking about private sector solutions and kind of organically living the American dream that way instead of through redistribution? Somehow they get elected once in a while, which is shocking.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Donald Trump talked very aspirationally about the American dream and about America as a whole and loving the country and patriotic. I think that's one of the reasons he got in, and as we already talked about, because people were so fed up with Washington. But look, I think what candidates ought to be talking about is how do we infuse more flexibility into the system, not just necessarily more free stuff. For example, the House this week is going to take up this equal pay type legislation. Well, here's the negative. It sounds good, but here's the negative. People going to the workplace, including many women, don't just want more money. In many cases, they want more flexibility. You know, but we want to put a size 10 on everybody. Everybody doesn't wear a size 10. Some people want more hours and more money. Other people want more flexibility. We ought to be encouraging legislation, and we ought to be encouraging employers and businesses to talk to one another about how do we work out what each one wants, as opposed to saying everybody's got to do the same thing. Because when you do that, everybody usually ends up losing, not just the businesses, but the employer as well.
You know, like I said, Basil, businesses themselves have come on board with a lot of these things. We did see a lot of employers who actually raised their own minimum wage internally, rather than wait for somebody else to do it for them. And when you get right down to some of these issues, Americans do want more, and in times of prosperity, you're probably going to see more of these things come about. But it's still a big question about how you pay for it, because even if you tax the wealthy all at 100%, you're not going to get enough to pay for some of these programs.
And I understand that, and I think one of the challenges that I've had over the last few months is trying to disabuse folks of the notion that Democrats actually do care about this too. We focus a lot of attention on AOC, And I understand why we do that. But if you think about even here in New York, there were 3 members of Congress that actually, Democrats that flipped seats. Across the country, it's not like you had all of these Democrats winning primaries. They flipped seats in Republican districts, which means to me that there is a lot of moderation in the Democratic Party. And to me, what that says is that we are campaigning on this idea that Americans do want more, but we also have to be fiscally responsible.
I don't have a graphic on this, but I can tell you that our data show some of these programs very popular in Republican districts.
Yeah.
And that could create a different political dynamic out there if any of these things ever get to the floor.
Genevieve, to that point, are you surprised by how much support there was in this survey? Whether or not you think it's the right position or not, does that surprise you and mean that the election might have to be fought on different grounds?
Yeah, I wish that it did, but unfortunately it doesn't. And I'll tell you one reason why. Look, nobody wants to talk about the deficit of the debt, including most Republicans.
Yeah, well,
so, you know, as long as the debt doesn't matter, you might as well just keep piling on. And frankly, both parties are guilty of, Republicans talk about it a little more than Democrats, but in general, nobody really talks about the problem of the debt and the deficits that we're running. Now, look, I don't think it's all about money, but it's a big problem.
Hey.
And if you don't talk about it, then most of the public kind of puts that to the side and says, well, let's just keep spending.
I'm amazed by how much you two actually agree on this.
We make a mistake, I think, and part of this is created by our poll in grouping all of these things together. They're not all of a piece, Genevieve. For example, a federal requirement that employers provide paid maternity leave to new mothers. That does not necessarily mean it's a federal program. There are economic costs to it, but that's somewhat different from, for example, tuition-free college, which has a definitive
and by the way,
cost.
what was the question? Are you in favor of tuition-free
Okay, I will read it
college,
to you.
or are you in favor of other people
question.
not paying for college if your taxes go up 20%?
The question is, from what you know, do you strongly support, somewhat oppose, or strongly oppose the following proposed government programs? And the item here is tuition-free college at state and public colleges paid for by the federal government.
Wow, okay, so they should be able to figure out that the taxpayers are...
Did I ask that wrong?
No, but they're not seeing their taxes. They're not connecting the dots.
No, but that's his was
We're
pretty.
doing the
His
best
was
we can
okay.
over
Yeah,
here.
his was okay.
No, but
paid for by the federal government, which
It says paid for by the federal government.
Paid for by the federal government doesn't mean you're going to get taxed.
But if I can add, so I teach at CUNY. CUNY used to be free. And look, there are a lot of parents out there who are voters, baby boomers and perhaps older, who a lot of their children are living at home because of their student loan debt.
And by the way,
Can't take advantage of the American
because
dream.
College tuition is out of control and because healthcare costs are out of control, and I get that.
And that's and Americans are feeling that. It's not about party, it's not about race. Americans writ large are feeling the pain. I have a niece in London. She talked about all of her college choices, and it was amazing to me that none of those choices involved a question of which college gives me the most financial aid. That's taken out of the conversation, and think about what that does for a student trying to look at what their options are going to be.
Can I just get Genevieve to respond to this? Genevieve, I wanted to ask you just continue the second half of my question, which is things like increasing federal government funding for child care. That's something that puts women potentially back into the workforce and has a positive economic contribution, especially at a time when where female labor participation is lower in America than it is in several developed countries.
Well, look, as I said, I'm all for talking about flexibility in the workplace, but when you mandate a certain policy, and let's be clear, we can say, well, these aren't going to be government policies. We're going to have employers pay for all this. Eventually, who ends up paying are the individual citizens of the country.
But to that point, it is like under the Family Care Act, I am allowed to take 12 weeks off. I may not get paid for it, but I'm allowed to take that time off. And
that's right. But again, when you...
And that costs the employer something, too. So we have said we want standards at some level. The question is if the standards move up.
And can we actually afford them? And again, when you start giving Americans the details on this, when you say it's going to raise your taxes, drop and percentage goes up, and when you say, well, then let's just take money from other programs, then people say, you know what, I'm even less in favor.
Right.
So again, as the details come out...
in the details, you're right. Genevieve, Basil, thank you both. That was a great conversation.
Thank you.
We'll have you both back. Thanks, Steve.
Free stuff.
All right, you'll get...